Welcome, everyone, to Forging New Partnerships, Blending Capital to Effectively Meet Your Mission. As we get started, I do want to note that we're recording the session and providing a few housekeeping tips. So on the top right hand of your screen, you'll see icons for the chat and Q&A features. We do encourage you to use the chat feature to comment, introduce yourselves, and interact with other participants throughout the session. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A box throughout the program as they occur to you. And then we'll address audience questions right after the session in our interactive Zoom room. So in the Zoom discussion room, you'll be able to use your video and audio to interact with our panelists and other attendees. So the capital raising process for CDFIs and other mission-driven lenders is often time-intensive, and it only becomes more so when markets tighten. Building a capital stack that works is an activity that requires creativity to match the capital available to the capital you need to execute on your mission and strategy at your CDFI. So I'm really excited to welcome our panelists for today, Tamara Dorfman, the CFO of San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund, and Eileen Neely, the Director of Lending and Housing Assistance Council. I really can't think of two better people to have this conversation around how to forge strategic collaborations and effectively blend various types of capital together. So with that, let's get started with Tamara. Can you tell us briefly, share your organization's mission and the primary focus of the Housing Accelerator Fund in terms of sector and products?
Yes. Hi. So the Housing Accelerator Fund, we focus on preserving and building new affordable housing and expanding the supply of affordable housing. And we do that through public, private, and philanthropic partnerships. So this is actually I'm super excited about this session because we'll get a chance to talk through how we go about raising capital from those sectors and bringing it together to solve hard to solve puzzles around how to expand and preserve the supply of affordable housing, especially in the Bay Area.
And Eileen?
I'm Eileen Neely. I'm the Director of Lending of the Housing Assistance Council. And our mission is exactly like Tamara's, except ours is in rural communities across the US. So couldn't be more different than San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So we make loans to developers who are building and preserving affordable housing in rural communities. Our lending is flexible. We provide what's needed to make a project work, everything from pre-development all the way to perm and mini perm. So throughout the development process, we don't have a very tight credit box or predetermined term box, because what might work for one project might not work for another. And so we want the projects to work and we want the developers to be successful.
Awesome. Thank you. So to get our conversation started, let's talk about the value of strategic partnerships. Like, why do these partnerships? Why engage with them? Why kind of like add all this stuff into the mix of raising capital? So can we talk about how strategic capital partnerships and collaborations have enhanced your organization's impact? And Tamara, we'll start with you.
This sounds so like obvious, but really having these different types of partnerships with different sectors has really allowed us to grow our capital stack and grow what we are able to deploy into the community so that we can have more affordable housing available. And the partnerships differ, depending on the type of entity it is. Like a partnership with what I'll call institutional partners, the banks, is going to be different than a partnership that we may have with a local community foundation. And we also have some partnerships with some healthcare companies, for example, because there's such a strong intersection between housing and health. And then we've been building partnerships with folks because we are focused in the Bay Area region. There's a lot of individuals, high net worth individuals, and some of them are really willing to put their capital into some of the types of initiatives that we're working on. And so there's a whole range of folks. And with each of those range of sectors comes, I would say there's different priorities that they have and also different willingness in terms of how they create the terms, so that by putting that together, we end up with a balance sheet that has some really standard term in terms of the loans that we're taking on, has some very standard terms. And then with some of the less traditional investor sectors, they're willing to take some terms where maybe they're willing to take a first loss, for example. So it gives us some diversity within our balance sheet that allows us to do those loans. And I think, Eileen, you had mentioned this either in the green room or already when we were on the call about trying to be a problem solver, because if the market was working, we wouldn't have to exist, but the market isn't working. So we bring together and blend capital so that we can do the deals that otherwise aren't going to happen.
I love that. And Eileen.
And I was thinking about this, like, what do we mean by strategic partnerships? And I thought back to 5 years ago when I started the Housing Assistance Council. Our loan fund was only 18 million. We had exactly one private loan on our books, and it was $1 million from Capital One. We basically had stopped lending. I was hired to kickstart our lending and really sort of grow it rapidly. And we had plenty of capital, but I knew if I believed my own growth projections, that I would need capital in about 9 months. And so it's a hard story to tell when you have, $14 million of undeployed capital on your books. You haven't borrowed from anybody. Like, to get somebody to believe your story. And I think back, and our first loan that we got, sort of who believed our story. We often as CDFIs talk about story loans, like on paper, it doesn't make sense. Their story's good. We were a story loan back 5 years ago. And it was Northern Trust who invested in Hack First because I had a previous relationship with the head of the CDFI lending. And so strategic relationships are not just with your organization, but it's with the individual who you are. And we always, we're a small industry. Some people stay in the same CDFI for 30 years and some move around. But those relationships that we build as individuals along the way are really critical, because you take them with you regardless of where you go. So I was really fortunate that I had that relationship. And then the other one was a bank who was getting a lot of pressure to invest in rural. And so they're like, nobody else is doing rural across the country. We want to make a loan. And that was Wood Forest. So recognizing the history and of personal relationships and personal history, and then the relationships of a bank with an aligned mission.
Yeah, and you both touched on themes that we're going to keep touching on throughout the rest of our conversation. But Tamara, from being like, hey, like the reason, like we have to raise capital to lend capital. If you're a loan fund, that's how it works. Like the capital you get, the flexibility of your lenders, it's what you have in terms of flexibility of what you're able to do. And so like finding the right sources, finding the right partners to be able to do that work that you really want to do, whether it's meet your mission, to kind of like scale deeper, to expand the reach of your services and products, like that's so critical to doing what we do. And you were kind of talking about that, both of you. And then Eileen, that like kind of like how important like finding and engaging the right partners are, and how that sticks with you. How do you build relationships? What does that look like? How do you find ones that work for your organization? All things we're going to talk about today. But really quickly, to ground the conversation, because we know it's an audience of practitioners, can you share an example, like a specific one, with strategic partnership or collaboration or CDFI pursued to raise capital, and then highlight the partners involved, and then how it enhanced your ability to meet your mission? And Tamara, we'll start with you.
I can start. So we have a very strong partnership with the San Francisco Foundation. So it's a local community foundation, and we worked with them. And it actually was basically just launching when I started with the HAF. So the thinking around it, the creativity predated me. But I've really seen how it's turned into a really valuable part of, and a large part of our capital stack. And what we did is identified that the San Francisco Foundation, like a lot of community foundations, have donors who put money into donor advised funds. But they give it to the foundation because that's when they get the tax break. But they may not be ready yet to make that final legacy investment or that legacy gift with their funds. And so foundations are oftentimes sitting on, and other DAF holders are sitting on a lot of DAF money. So the HAF worked with the San Francisco Foundation to create a vehicle where what the foundation would do is, if we had some folks who had DAFs at the San Francisco Foundation and they were willing to lend us the money for a period of time, we would pay it back. That gave them reassurance that they didn't have to make their final decision right now, but they were really happy to know that their funds were being put to use rather than just sitting in the account at the foundation. And so a couple of things that that is sort of the strategic part that was a win-win is that what we realized is that these DAF holders were not so concerned about return. They were really concerned about impact. And they were really concerned about maintaining their optionality. So they did want this money back. So the San Francisco Foundation, we worked with them to create this vehicle. But in terms of, we went into it, and actually we are doing an upsize now, and we asked again, like, do we need to offer a return? And we've been hearing back, you don't need to. So sometimes you might be surprised in a happy way. Sometimes you might get surprised in a sad way about what the investors' priorities are. But that has been a really valuable vehicle. And the other thing that it does is it's led into, because oftentimes the folks who are almost all of our investors, and certainly our larger investors, it was a relationship. This gets back to what Eileen was saying. It was a relationship that really started with our CEO, where she was having conversations with local, very civic-minded folks who were saying, what can we do about housing? I mean, it's such a big issue all over, and particularly in the Bay Area. And she would have these conversations, and they were thinking, like, what can I do? And then could bring up this conversation about, well, here's a vehicle that you could use to lend. And so I think that those partnerships really are both, institutional in the sense that the institutions have to trust each other, but they really are about people talking to each other. And we, as the CDFI, being aware of what is it that we're trying to solve for in our capital stack. And then from the investor side, what are they trying to solve for? So I just gave an example of one group of investors, but as we go through the session, there'll be other examples of where there's other investors that are trying to solve for a different thing. And it's been really, for lack of a better word, it's been fun and actually rewarding, because this all is towards, making sure that we can expand the supply of affordable housing, to find that there's oftentimes a bit of overlap, right? It maybe isn't the 100% overlap, where I'll start lots of calls sometimes with more institutional investors, and they'll say, what are you looking for? And I'm like, long-term, low-cost capital. And they're like, okay, yeah. So here, let's get into the details. But as you have these relationships, you can find some places of overlap where, like, okay, I can do that, and that gives me what I need, and you can do that, and that gives you what you need. And together, here's what we can do. So those are my thoughts on that.
Like, going back to like that, like just having a conversation and building and knowing someone, which is like you said, like was something that Eileen was bringing up. And I just remember, because like I used to work with Eileen, and I remember Eileen would always talk about like always ask for what you need, not just what you think you can get. And this reminds me of that,
Yes.
where like I think a lot of times CDFIs are in a place where like you ask for what you think you can get, not necessarily what you need, because the market doesn't always respond to that, and the relationships don't always lend you to being able to ask for what you actually need. And like building up the trust and building a partnership, like a true partnership, like the one that you're describing, can really make a meaningful difference on both sides. So at that, Eileen.
Yeah, I would say the strategic partnerships that have surprised me most have really happened since the pandemic, which is the alignment of housing and health philanthropy. And, all of us who are in housing knew pre-pandemic that a safe, stable place to live was the foundation to a healthier life, healthier outcomes. It's just a duh. But people in healthcare don't always think that way. They think it's access to medical care that gives you better health outcomes. But during the pandemic, it became crystal clear that housing, stable, safe housing led to better health outcomes. And so we've had 3 very strong partnerships with health philanthropy. One led to an investment into our loan fund, but the others have not lent directly as a investment in our loan fund, because they're very geographic based. And we're like, nope, we are national. So I'm not going to create a fund just for Western North Carolina. But what I found is they are investing in some of our projects. And so it makes our projects, the housing projects, more viable, safer for investments for us, and it often builds the social services in the projects that might not otherwise have them. So I think that's a really critical partnership. So every time I have a investment in their footprint, there's a couple of health philanthropies I call and say, hey, do you want to invest in this too? And that's been really good.
Yeah, and like I hear the element of education in there, like how you educate other people about CFIs and what they do, and that like alignment of mission and values and those common goals towards that we're working towards. Yeah. And so with that, you've both been talking a lot about different kinds of partners that kind of across the board, right? From like health foundations to banks to the public sector to philanthropy. So how do you go about identifying potential partners? Like, are there key factors or qualities that you've identified that help you determine whether a partnership will be effective?
One of the first things I did when I got to Housing Assistance Council was I read audits from a lot of similar CDFIs to figure out who was investing in them. And so there is, like, I am not embarrassed that I looked at RCAC and LISCs and Neighborworks Capital's audit, because many of them list their investors in the notes. So open it up, see who else is investing, whether it's, looking at other housing organizations or in your same geography. There's nothing to be embarrassed about that. So that was one of the first things I did. The reason is they're already investing in CDFIs. You don't have to educate on CDFIs. You can tell, I could spend the limited time that I'm given in that introduction to tell Hack's story.
And it feels like the perfect example of working smarter and not just harder.
I'm lazy, Sindhu.
That is like the exact opposite.
I think that so I think, there's the initial cut of sort of like, is there sort of what Eileen did, which is a great idea. I hadn't thought about that. But does there seem to be some shared interest? Then in terms of getting a sense of whether an institution or individuals or group of individuals are good partners, that I feel like comes from conversations. And so one of the things too, and Eileen, you mentioned this when you were in the early part, when you were talking about in terms of working with early investors, and there was a story that Rebecca, our CEO, and I, and Katie Vastola, who's manages our operations and is communications extraordinaire, we'll have conversations like the folks want to figuring out who it is that's best for them to talk to, and depending on what their interest is and kind of where they're coming at it, it's lots of times will be Rebecca Foster, who's our CFO or our CEO. And then sometimes if it's a partner that's the more institutional partners, they will usually come to me because we'll have the conversation about the half, and then it really quickly gets into our balance sheet. But that idea of having those conversations gives you a good sense. And if it's not a good fit, it's not always because it's bad conversations. It's just realizing there isn't a place of overlap. And then those conversations actually lead to other conversations where somebody's like, oh, have you talked to so-and-so? So a lot of it kind of comes through that. And we did, when we needed to look at doing some capital raising, we sat down and we sort of did a review of banks and looked at CRA things and whatever. And I'm not sure if we maybe reached out, and then other stuff started to come, our other conversations came our way. And we ended up kind of not having to focus so much on that and we realized they were coming through these conversations. And the other thing that has happened too, is we've had conversations with potential investors where the initial thing was like, oh, that isn't really going to work, but we keep in touch.
Yep.
And then another opportunity comes up, either that we'll think of and they'll be like, oh, they weren't so interested in this thing that we were working on, but now we're working on this, let's talk to them, or vice versa. So it feels very organic. And then the other thing that I would say, which makes it possible, because it's a lot of time and a lot of work, and really a lot more for Rebecca and Katie, who I've both mentioned. But one of the things that I observe that they do is we've got some decks, right? And and we have graphics that show what's our story. So there's the verbal communication of the story, but then also being able to, when you have like a quick interaction with somebody someplace and they sort of show some interest, they're like, I'd really like to hear more, being able to respond quickly so that you've got some go-to things where you're not having to recreate the wheel. And maybe there's a tweak that you do because they're specifically interested in something so particular. But lots of times we're just making sure that our standard deck is updated every 3 months or so that we can quickly turn it around with an email saying, that was a great conversation. Here's some more information about the half. We'd love to talk further.
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah,
point.
and
Go ahead, Eileen.
go ahead, Sindhu. You mentioned, Tamara, the CRA. If you don't have somebody in your organization who knows how to read a CRA assessment and a CRA report, you need to train somebody today. And maybe that's another training class, another OFN training opportunity. But I work very closely with my resource development manager, and she can like take a look at a CRA report and say, oh, they scored poorly in rural communities, their last report. So we have something to sell them. And the ones that don't have rural in their assessment area, they will be much lower on our list because we are not straying from rural.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, and this is like super tactical. And I think what I'm like, the couple of things I've been hearing from both of you is like, to like do your homework. So like to do that research, to do that homework and really know who you're talking to. You're using your time effectively, but also the friend of your friend is your friend.
Yep.
And so there's like, I think the fact that like a lot of people in our world, like if you're a mission aligned investor or you're invested and you're kind of like care about social purposes, that you are generally of a bend that you want to help. So even if you can't help yourself, that they might know someone who might be able to. And so like that two-pronged strategy, right? Of being smart and efficient with your time and how you're thinking about like doing your research, like Eileen, like you mentioned, like having someone who knows CRA, thinking about who already might be invested in CDFIs, and then pairing that with Tamara, the relationship building, which you can't get past. Like our work is just one of relationships, and that's how things happen. And so we can't, and I think it's like our lending is relational and so is our capital raising. And so figuring out how to blend those two together. Before we kind of like transition to talking about blending capital, can you just discuss some of the common challenges or obstacles you've encountered when it comes to building new partnerships and then how you navigate them? So let's say you've had this initial conversation, you've started talking to people, but like what are the challenges or obstacles that happen after that? And how you navigate it to get to like a commitment?
I'm going to jump in the easy one. Interest rates right now is an obstacle, obviously. But like I said, we're not straying from rural. So requests that we think differently or do, can you do all of Salt Lake metro area in addition to rural? The answer is no. So the requests for specific geographies. And then when we get questions about our credit philosophy, they're like, that sounds a little willy-nilly. We're like, that's what works. So I would say those are the three that I'm really honest about up front. Like 6% interest rate doesn't work, but let's keep talking. I can't do urban Salt Lake, but let's keep talking, and we're not going to tighten our credit box. We're not a bank.
Yeah, and I think maybe it was you, Cindy, who said it, but I think it's really true. Asking for what you need, not just for what you think you can get. And so that requires clarity about what it is you need and what's going to work, and then still being willing to have the conversation. So I actually had a recent, we were doing a renewal actually on one of our senior unsecured lenders, and they've been a longtime partner, but there had been turnover at the bank, et cetera. So we were working through the term sheet and we had discussed some things, and then the term sheet came back really different. And I was like, but we'd had enough of a conversation, and I think a lot of us in this world are pretty straight shooters. So I continued to be a straight shooter and explained why there was a deposit requirement, and we just, I mean, unless they're going to guarantee a really high interest rate on those deposits for the life of the loan, I explained why that doesn't work. And it doesn't mean that we don't, I'm now moving more funds through them for our operating that we need to have, because they did increase their interest rate. And I said, but the nature of our business, because we do construction lending, is that I have a place where I can keep funds that can be earning a lot when I don't need access to them right away. And it's a smaller amount that needs to be more, more liquid, and just sort of talked through it and said, this is what I need. And they ended up just taking the entire deposit requirement off, because they did what they needed to do. They started off with what they wanted. In the end, they didn't need it, actually, but I have no problem with partners starting with what they want. And then we need to explain what it is that we want. And I think it's actually a bit easier to do with institutional investors. It can be, I think with other types of investors, sometimes it's less of an issue on those types of terms, because they're so mission driven and there's not the sort of technical things that a bank would be concerned about necessarily. But it is still, I think, Eileen, you're exactly right, being clear about what our work is and where our biggest value add is, so that we're not taking money to do something that isn't where we can have, the highest and best use of what the half is capable of doing. And they could, we can suggest partners. So I think just, clarity around that and not being afraid to have the conversation. I really think people always appreciate being somebody who's being forthright and that they know where they're coming from.
And it's forthrightness with logic behind it. It's like you're explaining kind of like why it is that you can't do what someone's asking for, because there's a real reason behind it. And I think that's the important part. Is that for it's all about kind of like, this is what it takes to meet your mission. Like something is your core business product, it's your core geography for a reason, and just being able to articulate that. And again, like being comfortable or building the comfort in a relationship to say that, so that you don't get tied with capital or a partnership that doesn't actually meet your needs or that isn't going to benefit you in the way that you want it to. So once you kind of like are working with all these different partners, so there's a lot of different partners that come in when you're working with the CDFI at a CDFI. There's like the whole range of stakeholders that we raise capital from. And Eileen and Tamara, you both previewed some of these various partnerships. So like, you still need to make the capital stack work once you kind of identify and engage them. And that can be really, that's where the complexity hits in. Like when you're negotiating those agreements, when you're like, what can work and what doesn't? How do you kind of bring all this together to have a capital stack that actually works? And so Eileen, earlier on, you made up a great point about level setting around what it means when we're talking about blending capital. And the great point was that like as CDFIs, we're blending capital all the time, especially if you're a loan fund, what your business model is blending different types of capital, even if you don't call it that. But what we're talking about here is just how you kind of braid all of those together to deploy it for a specific product or a specific purpose. And also then we'll get to talking about how you make decisions around on and off balance sheet capital. So let's start with, again, some of the challenges. So what are the challenges you've encountered in blending different funding streams? And then how do you overcome those challenges to achieve your desired outcomes? Can't you want to start?
Yeah. I can start. So
go ahead.
I'm thinking about sort of in some different phases of the capital. There's those building the capital stack. I'll come back to that. And then there's the deploying the capital stack. So starting with building the capital stack, one of the things that, and this gets back to partnerships, is having partners that are willing to take just frankly more risk, that they're willing to sit behind others in that capital stack. So Eileen and I were talking earlier, and I think we both have versions of subordinate loans from investors that would be first loss, so that when we're reaching out to new investors who want to invest and give us good terms and what have you, but they're like, they want to make sure that they understand, because if it's an investment to the half, so it's not secured by collateral, it's basically they're underwriting our balance sheet, being able to walk them through and explain, like, should everything go sideways and there's an event of dissolution, look at what is the buffer between you and any loss. So, and when the half first started, before we had really been able to accumulate a significant amount of unrestricted net assets, now we're in a different position, but early on we had very little in unrestricted net assets. It was so important that we did have a subordinate investment from the city and county of San Francisco. And it is a loan, it shows up as a liability, but we could walk our other potential investors through that. That was absolutely key. And now it still is great. And we also have been able to, get a lot more unrestricted net assets on our books. Some of it's from retained earnings. Some of it, interestingly, actually tied to what we've been talking about, is we get a significant amount of grants to the loan, what I call grants to the loan fund. So it's not considered like operating grants. And some of those grants to the loan fund, there's two instances where the conversations actually started off about loans, but they were with, one was a philanthropy and one was sort of a quasi philanthropy. And in the end, they both ended up being grants. Now, it doesn't always happen, but it's in that conversation that those opportunities do arise. So, so there's the blending capital so that you can explain it to other folks and get a range of investors comfortable with the strength of your balance sheet. And then there's blending capital more around projects, but I'll stop there because if Eileen will, or I could continue on to the project specific, but you might have some thoughts on the enterprise level.
Yeah, no, I think I was fortunate when I joined the Housing Assistance Council. We were almost 50 years old when I joined. So we had 48 years of retained earnings. For many of those years, we got direct congressional appropriations, no more. Thank you, Tea Party. But that was really beneficial. It's why we could still have a loan fund and only $1 million from banks. So we've part of my job is easier because we are still very under leveraged for a real estate CDFI. So that's there. But when I think about blending, my policies are my rate to my end investor, my end borrower have to be a certain spread above my borrowed cost of capital. So that policy doesn't matter how much grant funds I write or I get. It only looks at the money I'm borrowing. So there's been one of these examples was somebody's like, well, should I just make this a grant or should I make it a 0% loan? And I was like, make it a 0% loan because then my blended cost of borrowed capital drops significantly. If it was a grant, it wouldn't count in either the denominator or in the numerator. So there's games that you have to play depending on your policies too. So, when I am successful getting a low rate from a health philanthropy that allows me to go closer to market from a bank and still grow and keep my rates to the end borrower. So watching the rates and not just looking at, this rate from this bank is too high. You can say, they're a great partner. They've been there from the beginning. I can blend that rate with one of these philanthropy rates is really critical because we have been trying hard to keep our interest rates to our borrowers as low as possible. We've only raised them by 100 basis points, despite the Fed raising by 600 basis points.
Yeah, that is a really good point around that. We're always looking at our weighted average cost of capital, and it is what allows us to keep our rates lower so that we can do the deals that are not being served by the market. And it does include some of those, the bit higher rates from banks. And of course, the concern is always like when I first started with the half, which was in early 2020, so it was right pandemic. And back then, interest rates, they had been low for a while, but they were really low. That was definitely hard. There's planning around that and this gets back to the terms that one negotiates. So there was, there was a long period, I think we were all in this situation where we had a negative drag. We're paying more for our capital than we're earning.
Mhm.
And in an organization like the HAF where we do construction lending, we need to have the capital committed, but we don't start charging interest on it until it's deployed. So we have this, and during that time it's sitting in the bank and it's earning zero. So it was really helpful. We had a couple of loans that we prepaid, a couple of our balance sheet loans that we prepaid early. It was getting close. We were within like 6 months of maturity, but 6 months of whatever the interest rate was to these banks was a lot, given that that was just going to be pure cost to us. We weren't earning anything on it. And it gets back to the terms that we had no prepayment penalties in our terms. And that's something to also talk to lenders about. Sometimes they will, that's so important to them that it's hard to get movement on it, but we've been able to get movement. And I think the lenders who are used to working with CDFIs, we're not going to be the first one saying, here's why having some flexibility on prepayment is really important. So I think that fits in as well.
Yeah, and so I think like what I hear is that like we talked about in the beginning, the capital raising is a creative endeavor. There's a lot of creativity that goes into it. It's a little bit like putting together a giant Tetris puzzle where you have to fit all the pieces of the puzzle together. And then a key component of that is the financial management. Like you're talking about some of the key ratios that you're thinking about, like your weighted average rate of your term loans and like the loans outstanding, and then your debt, and just how you're thinking about your asset liability matching, like kind of like your cost of capital. Like those are like that financial management aspect of how you're kind of thinking about raising capital and what fits in terms of capital planning and strategy is really important here. And then so I know that we're coming up on time, so maybe we can keep the discussion of like on and off balance sheet for our discussion room, because like that's like opening up a whole different set of questions. But I do want to close out our panel portion with lessons learned and your key takeaways. So as you reflect on your experience building these different kind of capital collaborations or raising capital, what are some of the key lessons learned or takeaways you want to leave with CDFIs and others listening in today?
I would say, so I'm thinking of two things that have both come up, which is that we talked about the importance of conversations and relationships, and to have that be a sustainable thing for an organization. Then that gets to how can we work smarter, not harder, in terms of having some basic kind of infrastructure stuff, which isn't about building out an entire development team. I mean, that just is expensive and it's hard to support, and it doesn't always result in what one needs, and that's true across any sectors. So it's thinking about what are those like kind of high impact touches that don't create so much work every time there's an interaction with a potential investor, because it's being able to respond quickly to those interactions with potential investors, not all of which turn into anything, but sometimes they do, that allows those conversations to start and then continue to grow, that then lead to the capital that we're talking about. So I would say those two things: being willing to have those conversations, but also thinking about what works for your organization to make that the support of those conversations not such a big lift.
And I would say my mission is, or my lesson is, keep your mission at your forefront. Remember why you are trying to grow your loan fund, and make sure that if you're growing your loan fund to increase your income to your organization, it's has a very different look than if you're growing your loan fund to have more mission, have more affordable housing in rural communities or San Francisco, depending on what your geography is. And then the other is, when you keep your mission at the forefront, you will know what you can and can say no to, or what you can and can say yes to. When Sindhu and I worked together, a book I used to quote all the time was, "When you give a mouse a cookie," and if you haven't read it, you should. But when you give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk. When you give him a glass of milk, he'll want to stay the night. Before you know, that mouse is living with you. So investors are the same way. Is if you hold your ground and know that you may be saying no to the first investor, but then you'll get somebody who's better aligned with you, is a better long-term strategy.
I think that is a perfect way to close out kind of our panel portion. I can't think of better last words. And so to those of you, to Tamara, Eileen, thank you for sharing your insights and expertise. To everyone else, thank you for joining the session today. If you're watching this live, I hope you join the interactive Zoom Q&A to continue our conversation and to ask questions. You can access the Zoom room by basically exiting out, in the chat box, you'll see the directions, but you can see the interactive link to join the room in the session description when you close out of the kind of live view. Give us a minute to switch over to the interactive room. And if you're not joining us, we hope you'll be back for closing remarks at 4:30. So with that, we will see you in the Zoom room.